What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Dylan Talks Tone. Today we are going to talk about grounding. How do we ground an electric guitar properly? I've got a few different styles of guitar here that are done a couple of different ways. We're going to go through some specifics. We might bust a couple of myths and make this whole thing a lot easier. Because, you know, a lot of people will go into a guitar and they'll be like, or they'll be playing their guitar and they'll be like, this noise is bugging me. How do I fix this noise, etc. And, you know, sometimes, and wondering what's supposed to be grounded and what isn't and all that kind of stuff. And then there's wires running everywhere and bad solders and all that kind of stuff. So let's just simplify the entire thing and we will show you how to ground a couple of the major types of wiring diagrams in your electric guitar. So let's get them on the bench, let's get them apart, and we'll actually show you with a meter. So let's go ahead and first of all talk about what we want to ground on an electric guitar. We could get super technical with all this, but the bottom line is this. Each of the pickups need to be grounded. The volume pot needs to be grounded. The tone pot needs to be grounded. The other tone pot needs to be grounded. The strings actually need to be grounded. Now that'll be different from guitar to guitar, and that's why we want to show you a couple of different guitar styles. Everything on an electric guitar grounds through the jack. So there's a kind of a concept that we want to get here is that we're not grounding components to each other for the sake of them being ground to each other. What we're really doing is we're connecting the grounds from all of the electrical components, including the strings, because that's part of the circuit, to the ground on the output jack. Because you're actually grounding the guitar through the cable at the amp. Okay, so there's no ground in the guitar actually. It's actually grounding through the cable in going all the way through to the amp. So everything needs to terminate at the ground at the output jack. Okay, so that's something that we need to think about. The other thing we need to think about too is since there is only one ground termination really in an electric guitar, then a ground, quote unquote, ground loop is not possible. So basically what that means, what a ground loop is when you have 2 points of grounding and then there is a difference in grounding potential between those two components. We have a whole video on ground loops, but to suffice it to say, there is no such thing as a ground loop in a passive electric guitar. All grounds terminate with this right here, so it can't be ground looped because there's no other ground for it to have a difference in potential with. Now, the only thing that could cause a ground loop effect is a bad solder. So just make sure all your solders are good and you will never have that ground loop effect in a passive guitar. When we get to how we wire this stuff, that's important because there's going to be people jumping in the comments with all kinds of wisdom. And if you just know that there's no ground loops in a passive electric guitar, then all of those things sort of go away. Okay, so we've got pickup, 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 volume, tone, tone on a Strat. We've got everything terminating at our output jack. This is the only guitar we're not going to actually take apart. So let me grab a loaded pick guard and we'll look at how that's actually done. So let's get in here with a meter. And so basically what we have, this black wire right here is the ground on our guitar cable. So what this means is that each one of these components, okay, is grounded. See, this one. It's going to be this side for this one because it's reverse wound. This one, the back of this volume pot, the back of this tone pot, and the back of this tone pot are all grounded. So all three of those components are grounded. Also, one leg of the capacitor is also grounded. Okay? So everything terminates with this one wire right here. So that will be the most effective way to test whether you have grounding on all of the key components. So your pickups, your volume, your tone, and your tone cap. You notice that we did not worry about the switch because there is no ground on the switch. The switch actually only has signal. It only has what we would call, what you could call hot wires, right? There's only signal going through here. You don't need to ground the switch. Now, there are certain guitars that the case of that it is grounded. Now, one of the questions that we get all the time is, what about this foil on the back of the pickguard? Well, if you'll notice here, we can get continuity, right? Do we get continuity here? We do. So technically, we could use the foil to act as the common ground for everything. I personally don't like to rely on it though, because the thickness of it is not very much. So if you'll notice, what I do here is I take a wire and I solder it from here to here to here, and I ground these all three together. And of course, this is the ground for the output jack, and it's grounded to the back of the pot. So we have everything terminating with the output jack. Now, a lot of folks will say, what about a ground loop, star grounding, all that garbage? Remember, it doesn't matter, because everything terminates with this wire right here. If you could take a wire and run it around in a circle. We'll look at it here on a Les Paul, and I'll show you. But basically, there's no reason to worry about any of that. I've got all three pickups grounded here. I've got the pots grounded here, and they're all terminating with the output jack right there. So that is how you do a Strat. Now, the only other thing on a Strat that we need to worry about grounding is every electric guitar needs to ground the strings somehow. So on a Stratocaster, this is how we do it. On the back of the pickguard, on the back of the volume pot also, is going to be a ground wire that's going to come through a little hole in the body right here. And it's going to be soldered to the tremolo claw. Since the tremolo claw is connected to the springs, is connected to the tremolo, and the strings are in there, now we have ground. In fact, we could probably check this right now. We go from the wire that came from the volume pot to here, and we have continuity between, well, you can't see it, sorry, it's off the screen. We have continuity, and actually, if we just touch one of the strings with, you see there, we have continuity between the circuit in the guitar and the strings, because we've grounded it through this trem claw. So like when you buy one of our loaded pickguards, you'll drop it in, you'll make sure that this wire gets soldered to the back of the volume pot, and then you'll attach your output jack, and it'll be done. That is how you check grounds and make sure everything is grounded on a Stratocaster. Let's look at a Telecaster next. All right, so here we have a Telecaster. Now, grounds on a Telecaster are done a little differently. We have the pots grounded to the back of the pot here, or I apologize. We have the pickups grounded to the back of the volume pot, okay? And then we have no wire going over to the tone pot, and that is because it can be, in this case, reliably attached to this metal plate. You see, we have, let's see, I'll put this up here, there we go. Don't worry, it's not scratching the guitar. So now we can go from volume pot to volume pot, and we can have a short right there because, or continuity, because this metal plate is reliable enough to do so. The only time on a Telecaster you really have to worry about this, or any guitar actually, is if your pots are mounted to something that is not conductive. So on a Tele Deluxe, for example, we need to make sure that this pot has a wire going over here. So if you ever order controls from me or wiring from me and it's going in a Tele Deluxe, make sure that I know that so that I can add a ground wire that goes from here to here, because we need to have continuity between the backs of these two pots, grounding through that there plate. So neck pickup, ground, ground. Bridge pickup, I'll show you how that's grounded here in a minute. Now, how do we ground the strings on a Telecaster? You can run an extra wire from the bottom of the bridge base plate, which a lot of people do. They'll drill a hole in the guitar and they'll run a wire from underneath the bridge underneath to here. But if you have a regular Telecaster, just a normal Telecaster, then the way the strings are grounded, So we'll use our meter and I'll show you. So let's go ahead and put a probe on a string and a probe over here, and we can see that that's grounded. And we can see that this bridge is grounded, right? And what you'll notice is the reason it's grounded is because that screw that mounts that pickup to that bridge is grounded. And the reason that is that way is because on the back of a Telecaster pickup, we have this metal base plate. This metal base plate has these mounting screws in it, right? They come up from the bottom. So this is actually one of my custom ones, but the screws come into it, right? And they then touch the bridge then touches the strings, and the strings are now grounded. That if you do not have a metal base plate on your bridge pickup, then you'll need to make sure that somehow your bridge is grounded. When I build a guitar from scratch, I usually run a separate ground wire just because, but you don't have to because you're grounded through the pickup. If you get aftermarket pickups, just make sure that they have a base plate that grounds it as well. In this case, everything is grounded pretty easily because of all the metal plates and everything, and it's pretty simple to do. Now, the only other quote-unquote grounding anomaly most of the time that can happen is if we put a 4-way switch in a Telecaster with the series, then you'll also need to, when we sell the 4-way kits on our site, to where we sell a kit on the website, and you'll see it where there'll be 4 switches here where it'll be, neck, middle, bridge, but there will also be an extra setting for these 2 pickups in series. When that's the case, we need to make sure that we have an extra ground wire for this cover. So on the back of a neck pickup for a Telecaster, there is a ground that grounds the cover so that when you touch it, it doesn't buzz. So here's a good point. If you ever have a Telecaster and you touch this cover and it goes bzzzt and you let go, then you know that the ground has come off and you need to ground that cover. When you do a 4-way switch situation, if you don't have a 3rd ground, this becomes hot when you flip it into that 4th position. So we just need to make an extra one. No big deal there. Pretty easy stuff. So ground the volume pot, ground the tone pot, that goes through this plate, ground the strings, that goes through this plate, ground the pickups to the back of that volume pot, and you're all good there. And you can see that it's pretty easy to check continuity on a Telecaster. Let's move on to a Les Paul. Now there's a couple different variables going on with a Les Paul. One is we need to make sure that, there's a couple things here. One is that we now have a bunch of wood here. How do we ground, and the strings don't touch the pickups, etc., like on a Telecaster. So how do we ground, there's no tremolo, so how do we ground this string assembly to all of our controls, thus to our output jack? On a Les Paul style guitar or a SG or a 335 or anything that's got this kind of bridge setup, typically what it is there is a wire that is pinched between one of the threaded inserts that goes into the body. Depending on the brand, it could be here on this post or here on this post. It just depends who makes the guitar. And then there will be a wire that's like pinched between there, and then it goes through to out to here, and that's what grounds the string assembly, okay? Depending on the switching on a Les Paul, this is one switch where you will have maybe a ground on the center post over here. In fact, let's just check that right now because we can actually check those sorts of things. Yeah, so on this guitar, because of the way the switching is set up in the guitar, the case of this switch is grounded. See, I touch a string and I touch there and it's grounded. So, because there's a bundle of wires on a Les Paul that goes from here all the way through the body up to here, and there are pickups hooked up here, and part of that is there is a ground on the base of this switch. All right, let's see what else. Let's go ahead and flip this thing over, and I'm going to show you a couple of variables that could happen with grounding a Les Paul. Now, remember that every component in here needs to be grounded as well. So we need to ground the volume pots and the tone pots. Now you'll notice on a real Les Paul, here's a piece of tape on my knife. You'll notice on a real Les Paul, there's a metal plate down here, and that actually grounds everything together. So it's pretty easy because this is a common ground situation. Now, remember we talked about on the Telecaster, when it's not mounted to metal, you'll have to run a wire around there. That's what you would do on an Epiphone or any kind of copy Les Paul that doesn't have this metal base plate, okay? So you'll notice that there's no wires soldered to the back of here. But what you would do in a situation where this is just mounted into wood, which most other guitars except for regular real Gibson Les Pauls do, usually it's just mounted to wood. So then you would take a bare wire and solder it here, solder it here, solder it here, and solder it here. Now, many people will say that that causes a ground loop, and then they have to go into some sort of star grounding BS. But remember, it all terminates with the ground that goes to the right here, which means that there is no way for a ground loop to happen, because there's no difference. As long as the soldering joint is good here, 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 and here, there's no difference in ground potential at those 4 points. It's science. It's science. Anyway, so there you go. That is grounding a Les Paul. That's pretty easy. Just make sure that all 4 of these components are grounded and that the body of the switch is grounded. Oh, and one more thing. This right here, see this little hard wire right there? See that wire that's coming in there? That's the one that's coming from the bridge on the back side, that little stud. On the side of the stud, it's coming through. So just make sure that that gets grounded to the back of one of these pots too. Okay, so now let's go through some scenarios to help you troubleshoot whether your guitar is grounded properly, okay? And the first one we want to talk about is, because I get this email all the time, is when I let go of the strings, it buzzes, and when I touch it, it gets quieter. What's wrong with my guitar? Because it gets so loud when I let go. You are part of the ground in that situation. So your guitar is supposed to get quieter when you touch the strings. In fact, that is one good way of making sure that everything is grounded. If you just let go of all the strings and you don't touch anything, and then you touch the metal part of a volume pot and it gets quiet. You touch a metal part of a volume pot and it gets quiet. You touch the output jack and it gets quiet. You touch the strings and it gets quiet. You touch, it depends on the pickup. On a single coil it won't do it, but on a humbucker it will. If you touch the mounting screw here on a humbucker, it will get quiet, right? So in all those situations, it makes sense because you're part of the ground at that point. Therefore, the guitar will get quieter. Now, the opposite situation can happen. What if you are not touching the guitar and it is quiet, and then you touch the strings and it goes brrr, really super loud, or you touch the output jack and it's really loud? What that typically means is that you have your output jack hooked up backwards and you're actually ground to hot and hot to ground. So that will happen a lot of times when folks install a loaded pickguard, or they will install a tele control plate or whatever, or they will replace an output jack. If you ever touch it and it gets louder, that means that the hot is where the ground is supposed to be, and vice versa. Most other scenarios in the guitar, if something's not grounded, it simply will not work. If your tone pot doesn't work, it's very rarely a pot failure unless it's an old guitar. You'll hear that scratchiness happening before the pot completely fails. It's even less frequent, very rare, to ever have a capacitor fail. So if you have a capacitor, a tone pot that doesn't work, that's usually because there's no ground on it. That's usually because you've got something mounted to plastic or wood that needs to have that pot grounded and it's not there. Therefore, just go add that wire and it'll probably work. If you ever turn your volume knob down and it goes down some, but it doesn't go all the way down, that's probably because your volume pot is not grounded. That can happen when you bend that little tab over and you screw it to the, or when you solder it to the volume pot. Sometimes if that doesn't make good contact, or if you've got a little gap in there, because you know it's kind of a pain sometimes to get that to go right if you're not a super experienced at soldering, make sure that that little tab gets grounded to the back of the volume pot and that it is grounded to your output jack. If that does not happen effectively, you can turn your volume down and it won't go all the way down. Like, it might work a little depending on the pot, but it won't go all the way down right. You're like, why isn't this going? It's not turning all the way down to 0. That's usually because of that. If you ever touch your strings on your guitar and it doesn't get quieter, the very first thing I would check is just to make sure that your strings are grounded. That can also happen on reinstall situations and things like that. Now, grounds don't typically wear out. You don't typically have a guitar that gets noisier over time. Usually it's upon replacement of components. So the only time that you can usually, now there's variables to everything, right? But usually the only time you'll end up having noisy stuff and you'll have something that's improperly grounded is if you do not have a good solder joint on something. So when you replace something, go and you have something noisy, go back to the very last solder joint that you did and check that. Check the very last repair that you did and make sure that your solder joints are good. Because while we cannot have a ground loop in an electric guitar, a passive electric guitar, what we can have is bad ground potentials because of bad solders. So bad solders will be higher resistance than good solders, and that will cause the effects of a ground loop in your guitar. So make sure that you go test all your solders and make sure that they're very good. And for those of you that are not from America, solder. I'll just throw that in there once because some ding dong will be in the comments complaining if I don't. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully this gives you a little rundown, troubleshooting, various things like that, and some actual looks at some grounding circuits in a guitar. This does not cover all of the wackier stuff like phase shifting and all the various things that we would do with a guitar. This is just basic troubleshooting, and hopefully it helps with some misconceptions with guitar wiring as well. If you have any questions about this stuff, get in the comments and let me know. Thanks for hanging out, and we will see you in the next video.